suppose, where does one start with a biography like this? And one of the questions that I should kind of bat straight away is, why me? Why did I write this particular book? And more interestingly, why were Penguin foolish enough to publish it? I started, like all things, I suppose, this took a long time. It took 7 years of research and writing to get this book to you all. And in my case, what led me into this was curiosity. I grew up in the UK, and I came to India for the first time as a 22-year-old, backpacking, trying to find my family roots. And ever since I was 22, I started to come here for travel, for business, and to meet friends. And I'd made a lot of friends here. And everywhere I went, every nook and cranny, a village, urban centers, business chambers of commerce, schools, hospitals, even tribal areas, I would keep hearing something called the RSS. I just kept on bumping into the RSS. In one shape or another, they were there, in some way connected. When I would ask people about the RSS, I was confronted with incredibly strong opinions. Very, very strong opinions. Almost everybody I met had an opinion. When I scratched the opinion, I began to realize that very few people had any deep understanding or exposure to this movement. Furthermore, I would ask about the founder, I would ask about of Hedgewar, and very few people had very little to say. There was just nothing out there. And so I started to read. I started to follow literature. So I first started off with the academy, which is where someone like me you would think is a natural place to start. So I started reading Christoph Jeffrelow's Hindu Nationalism. I started reading a lot of the other Indian authors that were writing about the RSS and its history and its values and all the rest of it. And very quickly I discovered what I call a vortex of references. I discovered that most of these academics, although well-intentioned, I mean, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, they were citing each other in a circular vortex. And that vortex, like a vortex, gets a magnitude of its own. And so what few scanty references there were magnified. Magnified till, you know, when you repeat something over and over again, it becomes the truth, right? It becomes common sense. So when I discovered the vortex of circularity and referencing that was going on, I began to go, okay, well, let me go to the source. I went to the RSS literature. As I discovered the RSS literature, I discovered there's very little in English, for a start. Very little in English. What there was in English was written for a different time, for a different audience, with a different tone. And for people like me, it was incredibly hard to absorb that historical narratives that were coming out of the RSS. And when it came to Hedgewar, it was incredibly, well, they were hagiographies, right? They were reverential. Of course they were, because they were written from within the movement. So they were reverential in nature. They were there to, actually they were written for an internal audience, not really an external audience. And so again, there was nothing in global setting. How do you set Hedgewar, Hedgewarian thought, the Hedgewarian mind, his philosophy? Why? Why Hedgewar? Out of all the contemporaries, out of all the intelligent people that existed in India at that time, why was it Hedgewar that formed the RSS? How did he get the idea? How did he draw? Which influences did he draw on in order to build this worldview? Right? What were the personal struggles he went through? What were the contradictions that he held within himself? After all, he was a human being, and like all human beings, we are all constructs of our environment to a large extent. Now, what were those constructs? What were those influences? I wanted to know. And so I began to complain. That's what happened. I actually complained. So here's a lesson for all you young people. If you complain too hard, they're going to say to you, why don't you write it then? And that's what happened to me. I had a very senior pracharak who I was speaking to, who I had regular contact with, and he eventually said to me, look, Sachin, if you think you can do better, why don't you? And so I laughed. I kind of said, I'm in London. I have no access to archival material. What am I going to do? But he was serious, and he said, I can get you access to the archival material. Have a go. So I was curious. And so I have a background in philosophy and comparative religion. I spent 2 years studying Christianity and Islam. I studied political philosophy at Nottingham. So I thought, okay, well, I can have a go. I know my research methodologies. We can have a go. I've never written a biography. I've never written a book. But here's an opportunity. Here's a curiosity that has been scratching my mind for many, many years. So let me go. So I started exploring. I found myself in Nagpur. I found myself in front of archives. I found myself, you believe it or not, I had a map from the British Library of Nagpur from 1902. I had Google Maps on the other hand. And I literally walked the streets of 1902 and 21st century Nagpur to see which streets were still around. And I walked from where his house was to his school. His school has now become a zoo, right? So I could walk the streets. I saw the lakes where he swam in. I went to some of the hills where he played. And all of these things some of these informations were in different hagiographies or biographies or in different references in different textbooks. So I tried to bring him to life. I even, went to the British Library, by the way, is a treasure trove for a historian. It really is. It's marvelous. There is so much out there. And so I used the British archives actively. Just to give you an example, even when he spent 1 year in prison, when you read anything about Hedgewar and his 1 year in prison, if you read the RSS literature, it's all very, he went to prison, and he just toughed it out. And he influenced everybody in the prison. He came out of the prison, and he was even healthier than he went in. It was kind of very much fine. Reality is very different, because I found a video in the British archives from 1917, black and white video, no sound, where this videographer is showing you how prisoners were treated in Nagpur prison. And you could clearly see that there were the political prisoners, how they were treated, and how everybody else was treated. What I did know about Hedgewar was that when he went to prison, to this same prison in 1921, which is only 4 years after this video was taken, he chose not to be treated like a political prisoner. He chose to be treated just like everybody else. I saw the video of how everybody else was treated. It was rough. It was tough. Under the guise of discipline, there was abuse. And I can only conjecture what Hedgewar would have actually gone through. And it's not a surprise to me that after he comes out of prison, his health begins to fail. Prison was not easy if you chose not to be a political prisoner. So these things I try and bring to life in the book. So I try to bring him alive. This is not a polemic. So I'm not being critical, nor is this a hagiography, nor am I reverential. I want to demonstrate the mind of Hedgewar, the philosophy of Hedgewar, the character of Hedgewar, and most importantly, the influences around him, right? Both of people and of circumstance. So I will just share some thoughts with you. Why is this important? Why did I bother spending all this time? And the more I dug deeper, the more motivated I became. I feel, having written this book, maybe some bias as an author who spent 7 years doing it, I think Hedgewar and his legacy, his creation, has shaped modern India and is shaping modern India. His legacy, therefore, is more potent than any of his contemporaries. That makes Hedgewar's ideas more relevant today than they've ever been, and it makes Hedgewarianism more potent than any other philosophy that was around pre-independence, post-independence, and even today. I think, and let me be categorical, I think his ideas and his worldview is more influential today on 1/5 of humanity than anybody else's. I think he is today more influential than Gandhi, Nehru, Bose, Ambedkar, you name it. Modern India is shaped in some deep sense through the mind of Hedgewar. And the irony is, look at the irony of it. I'm sure if Hedgewar could be here with us, he would raise an eyebrow. Here is a British Indian guy, 100 years later, writing a book on his life, and his creation not just shapes modern India, it shapes 30 million strong diaspora around the world, and his ideas are now shaping other cultures, other nations. I don't think he would have expected that. No way. He was a foresighted seer, there's no doubt about that. He had a foresight that I don't think many did. And he understood the contours of the world better than most people did. But I don't think he would have imagined this. I don't think he would have imagined the potency of his thoughts and where they've got to. So Hedgewar is relevant. He's more relevant now than ever. He needs to be studied more than he's ever been. And I don't think we need hagiographies. And I don't think we need polemics. I just think we need to discover the truth. I just think we need to explore the case, the what is. And when you discover the what is, I think it will enrich our discourse, it will enrich our ability to communicate about who we are, what we are, where we want to take this country, where do you want to take the Indian society, right? And so this book, I hope, it's the beginning of a conversation, not the end. There's lots and lots of gaps in the book that I've not been able to fill. In fact, I will tell you, I only had access and I only had time, even after 7 years, to really penetrate about 40% of the literature. There's still a lot of literature out there that hasn't been analyzed, that hasn't had an objective view. So maybe there is somebody in this room that will be smart enough and more intelligent than I, with the same rigor, maybe better rigor, to go and build upon this book and do a better job. So this is the beginning of something. I should also get that clear from the beginning. Let me just give you some basic tenets of what I think Hedgewarian thought is and where I think it comes from. Hedgewar's life can be bucketed into 3 compartments, broadly, and many of you will know this. There is the Hedgewar, that is the young man who suffers, right? There's a struggle in his life. Orphaned at the age of 12 from the plague. He sees an India, and let's be clear about this. We need not be sentimental, but let's be clear. The India that Hedgewar grew up in was decrepit. It was deindustrialized, highly illiterate, highly superstitious, backward, unscientific, colonized, famine, pestilence, war, fragmentation. In fact, I can tell you, I found letters of Christian theologians who were writing around this time, 1890s. And they write that Indian society is surely on the verge of collapse. This is the end of an old civilization. Because if you were living in those times, you would have seen India at its lowest ebb. The heights of 6th century, 4th century, 6th century AD were long gone. Long gone. Those Indians were long gone. So he grew up at a time when India arguably would have hit an all-time low, right? So he would have seen that firsthand. So he's orphaned. He then, but look at life. Look at the way in which life deals its cards. So on the one hand, he's orphaned. Imagine the trauma that causes a 12-year-old. That your mother and your father die on the same day caused by a disease. What does that do to you psychologically? Right? What might that do to you psychologically? Right? That's one. Number two is, Indian society, because death and famine and tuberculosis and cholera, these things were rife, Indian society had built constructs to support orphans. When a young person was orphaned, Indian society had built infrastructure to cope with it. And so people within the local community would adopt. Anybody under 16, they would be adopted. So Hedgewar at the age of 12 was adopted. He was adopted, I mean, not adoption the way you'd be adopted today, because we're talking about, 1902. But he was effectively, his father figure becomes Dr. Munje. Munje, for those of you who don't know, was an eye surgeon, which made him incredibly rich and wealthy and educated and elite. He was a retired British military officer who fought in the Boer Wars. For those of you who don't know, the Boer Wars in South Africa were brutal. And so Munje goes from being an Anglophile, and after the Boer Wars he sees what the British can do and what the British are about, and he withdraws from the British and he becomes a nationalist. He's heavily influenced by Tilak, he's close to Tilak, and Munje becomes his father figure. So the young Keshav goes from being orphaned one day to being adopted by one of the most powerful, richest men in Nagpur, in Maharashtra. That's life, isn't it? And I wonder what would have happened to Keshav if it wasn't Munje who adopted him and somebody else had adopted him. Because that gave Dr. Hedgewar, who later becomes Dr. Hedgewar, today I'll call him Keshav at this age, this first phase, it gives him exposure to a new world. He suddenly gets exposed to Tilak. He suddenly gets exposed to political organization. He suddenly gets exposed to political thoughts and political ideas. He suddenly is absorbing the world around him in a new way. And most of all, Keshav was the first person in his family to adopt and to be given an English education. The English language, and let me just put some stats on this so you get the context. Only 10% of males in India in his time could read and write. Only 10%. And only 3% could even speak or read or write in English. In women, it was 1% who were literate. And the number of women that could speak English was in the 0.1, 0.2%. It's a highly illiterate society. So just to be literate puts you in the top 10%. If you can speak English, you're immediately in the 3% of the world, of the country's population. And Hedgewar suddenly finds himself amongst the elite. And suddenly with English, he's absorbing the Maratha newspaper and all the political thought with that. He's suddenly absorbing European philosophy. He's absorbing Nietzsche. He's absorbing the Greek philosophers. He's absorbing Karl Marx. He's absorbing Mazzini, right? So he's absorbing global thought. He's now able to read newspapers in England, of England. He's able now to follow what's happening around the world. And he's deeply curious. This was a curious young man. And he wanted to understand why his society was the way it was and why there was this force that was ruling the country. In the book, I call the British the Leviathan. Why do I call it the Leviathan? Because we don't appreciate this, but Keshav would not have seen a white person until he got to Calcutta at the age of 18 to study at university. Most Indians live their entire lives never seeing a white person. Indians were subjugated by Indians. Keshav saw that. I think Keshav realized that. Because when he goes to Calcutta is where he sees the bureaucracy. He sees the magnanimity of British ingenuity, British bureaucracy, British military, British technology. And he begins to see, oh my God, there is something seriously wrong with the society in which I come from. He hadn't diagnosed it, but he knew there was a problem. He was honest enough and he was earnest enough to reflect on that. And you can see his inner churnings. You could see in his movements the inner churnings that he went through. So he becomes this radical revolutionary. He wants to out the British. He studies medicine by day, and he smuggles arms by night. I mean, you could literally make a movie of this person, right? A student who is studying the highest forms of science and technology in the daytime, and then he's collecting funds from dark alleyways, going to the barracks, smuggling guns from British officers, and then those guns are being smuggled on trains and other transportation going into Maharashtra. Right? He's literally risking his life. If he was to get caught between that period where he's a university student, he would have faced the gallows. There's no doubt about that. He would have faced the gallows. So he was on the edge of the freedom struggle. He was not giving speeches. He was not, he was on the edge of the freedom fight. To the edge meaning that one mistake, and if he was caught, he was going to be hung. Because to smuggle arms was not a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year prison sentence. It was pretty much death, or you'd end up in the Andaman Islands for a very long time. So he was on the edge. That's that phase of Dr. Hedgewar. He then becomes a medical doctor, right? And I wonder why he became a medical doctor. You know, think about who his father figure was, right? Also, how does a man who was orphaned at 12 end up at Calcutta, one of the center of power of colonial India, but also one of the greatest cities of Asia, one of the greatest cities of the world. Calcutta at that time was an economic powerhouse. Absolutely economic powerhouse. It had cutting-edge technology, cutting-edge innovation. The bridges that were connecting Calcutta were some of the most pioneering bridges in the world at that time. The train station of Calcutta, which the British engineered, was awestruck. I mean, it was something pioneering. So he would have seen all of this. The second phase of his life is that he realizes that to beat the British, bombs and guns are not going to cut it. It's just not going to cut it. There may be space for that, and maybe there is a need for that at times. But the way in which you're going to beat the Leviathan is not through that. So he goes into what I call the second phase of his life, where he joins the Congress, he becomes a Congress activist, he joins the political struggle, he supports what I call the Republican side of the Indian National Congress, along with Tilak, Munjay, etc. And then he discovers something. He discovers that maybe actually there's not a political solution here either. There's something much more deeper going on. He decides to transition out of being a political nationalist, and he discovers something called cultural nationalism. These words I throw at you, I'll just share with you very briefly, because it's worth appreciating the subtleties of the Hedgewarian mind. So he goes from an angry revolutionary to a political activist who believes in political nationalism, and he transitions out of political nationalism into cultural nationalism. Right? By the time 1921, 1922 comes along. This is pre-RSS, right? What is political nationalism? Political nationalism is when one believes the state, not the government, the state is real. And you have to capture the state, and then through the state, you build the society. You build the nation. That's political nationalism. Cultural nationalism is where you believe that the society is real, the Rashtra is real, and the Rajya is secondary or imagined. So you have to build the Rashtra first in order to have an effective Rajya. Political nationalists think the other way. Rajya first. You control the Rajya to then influence the Rashtra. Hedgewar was, I believe, one of the few, but certainly the most far-sighted individual of his time that transitioned out of political nationalism and into cultural nationalism. And remember something, Motilal Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru's father, visits the young Hedgewar as an activist when he's in that Congress phase of his life. And he's offered power. He's essentially offered power at the, he's offered a seat at the table. And Hedgewar rejects it. Hedgewar rejects power, and he chooses instead to go and set up a grassroots organization with a handful of young men, which he didn't even name at that time, which then today, later, we call the RSS. And he goes into cultural nationalism because he fundamentally believed that political nationalism wasn't enough. There was something even more deeply problematic with Indian society. And so Hedgewar, between this phase, I believe, develops a critique of Hindu society, of Indian society. And effectively, his critique goes something like this. Indian society fell from grace, fell from its heights, because Indian society was no longer innovative. It was no longer innovating things, technology, ideas, culture, arts, you name it. It became fossilized. Why was it not innovating? It wasn't innovating because the society had no social mobility. What is social mobility? Social mobility is effectively where human beings can rise from wherever they start off in life and they go up. And if you rise at the top, but you're not good enough, you'll go back down. Socio-economically, in your standing, culture, whatever. So there's social mobility up and down. A socially mobile culture, a socially mobile society is the most innovative society. That's not controversial, that's just the way it is. Now, he sees that Indian society was no longer socially mobile. Why? Because it's become fossilized into caste, class, and creed. By creed, I mean religion. So essentially, you had pockets of Indian society, Hindu society, that were so fragmented, and you were condemned to your own fate, no matter your talent, no matter your genius, no matter your ability, to your caste, to your class, or to your creed. And so fundamentally, he draws this critique, and he says, what Indians lack, and he uses the word Rashtrabhav. He uses this word, Rashtrabhav. Right? Today, I would translate that as social capital. What Indians lacked was social capital. What is social capital? Social capital is essentially my ability to build relationships with my fellow human being. When I build relationships with my fellow human being, when I build a sense of trust with him, that trust creates cooperation. Cooperation creates society, creates relationships, creates innovation, creates businesses, it creates families, and so on and so forth. When social capital dries up, and social capital ends up in pools of caste or class or creed, now you don't have the social capital to cross bridge and to communicate and to meet people that you otherwise would never meet. So ideas don't flow. Ideas become stale. People become stale. Right? So he decides and he realizes that the fundamental diagnosis that he makes of Indian society is the lack of social capital, Rashtrabhav. How do you reverse that when for hundreds of years it has decayed? And so he starts a social experiment. And it is an experiment. That's why he doesn't name it for the first 1 year. Right? Let's just try something. And they try something called a shaka. What is a shaka? Shaka is essentially a node where people come together, where caste, class, and creed don't exist in that space. In that space, caste, class, and creed doesn't exist. I'm talking about the Hedgewarian mind, right? I'm talking about the Hedgewarian view of the world, where caste, class, and creed does not matter, where you train together, you play together, and through gamification, you build community. You build friendships. You build trust. Through trust comes cooperation. Through cooperation comes organization. Now suddenly, you have sympathy, you have empathy, you have compassion for your fellow man, for your fellow neighbor. And suddenly, caste, class, and creed are no longer that important. The Rashtra becomes more important. And that's what he did, that's what he created, the Shaka. And these Shakas started spreading. And that engine of social capital is still going strong today, isn't it? Right? Today, India is hugely shaped by the cooperation, the organization, the efficiency of what that social capital creates through gamification, through games, through meeting together, eating together, playing together, training together, learning martial arts together, whatever it might be, right? And why does he start with men? Let me just answer that question as well. Why does he start with men only? Why not women? Let me tell you something about the Hedgewarian mind. He was, in his critique of Hindu society, I believe he was very clear that the emancipation of women was a must. Women in Indian society of his times were in a bad place. The treatment of widows was particularly bad. And I don't think I'm saying anything controversial. History speaks for itself. And he felt that Indian society had to let go of these things. As a doctor, there were very few doctors in those days. As a doctor, when cholera outbreaks were happening, as a male, he could readily treat any other male and save their lives. But he could not administer medication to a woman because he was a man. And he saw women die needlessly. What do you think that does to a young man? Remember, he had 3 sisters. Right? He had a sister-in-law. Right? Munje's wife becomes like a second mother figure for him. Now, but he lived in a society where he was already radical. He was already, quite controversial of his day. Dr. Hedgewar was not scared of controversy. He was brave. He could face up to his own society and say, this is wrong, this is right, this is what we're going to do. That bravery, that courage, I think is admirable. But in that, he knew that he could not incorporate women into the social experiment that he had started in 1925. That's why he waits for 10 years and he looks for someone. And that someone arrives in the form of Lakshmi Kelkar. And Lakshmi Kelkar, who is a widow, right? So once you're a widow, you can forget love and all that. That's all gone. You're a widow, that's it. But because she was incubated by wealth, she inherited a vast fortune from her husband. She saw the effect that this social experiment called the Shaka had on her children. And so that social experiment, that the effect it had on her children was the inspiration that she went to Hedgewar and said, why aren't we doing this for women? Absolutely, why aren't we doing this for women? Now you're here, you lead it. And the rest is history. So I explain all of these things and I want to share this with you because I think there's much to glean from the Hedgewarian mind, the Hedgewarian worldview. He was not building this movement for independence. Let me be clear. He was building this movement to rebuild a Rashtra, right? He was rebuilding it because he understood fundamentally that Indian society lacked the social capital to build a coherent nation. And in order to build a coherent nation, you have to build what's called bridged social capital between communities. And this was the format that he created, which is why he made sure that the RSS in its early form, when it was vulnerable, when it didn't have much money, when it didn't have it was just a new experiment, it did not get co-opted by the Congress. It did not get co-opted by the Hindu Mahasabha. It did not get co-opted by Subhash Chandra Bose's the front, right? He made sure that it would remain something that was dedicated to the people, a grassroots movement away from the Rajya, only for the Rashtra. That Hedgewarian clarity, I think, is fascinating. I think it's interesting. And I think it still speaks to us today. At least it ought to speak to us today. So when we think about popular discourse, I would say as you read this book, firstly, I hope you enjoy it. I think he's a deeply entertaining character. And whether you like him or dislike him, or whether you like the RSS or don't like the RSS, whether you're skeptical or you're not, by the by, I hope you read this book the way it is, in the sense of here is a man who was a radical, he was a thinker, he was a philosopher, but more than everything else, he was a social reformer. And I think the clarity with which he saw the critique of his own society and then the solution that he comes out with, I think it's fascinating. I think it's worthy of study. I think it's worthy of exploring deeply what is going on here in the underbelly of modern India. And today in the discussion, when Western academics and Indian academics only see the RSS through the myopic lens of the BJP, it's a shame. They miss 90% of the beauty of Hedgewarian thought, Hedgewarian mind. To understand Hedgewar, you have to go to Hedgewar, right? And so this is a book that really, I hope, inspires conversation, dialogue, discussion, debate. And we live in a world where debate, is almost a taboo, where we cannot agree to disagree. I think we should agree to disagree. I think we should sit around a table with those who disagree with us and explore, and have the confidence to explore. So I hope this book inspires all of those things, and more than anything else, I hope all of you enjoy it. And thank you for coming.